1940, when her infant daughters were aged 2 and 3, a young mother named Phyllis Ebbage, after feeling unwell, would attend her local doctor's clinic for a checkup. Little did Phyllis know it would be a checkup that would uproot her comfortable life with her husband and 2 children in a way she could never have imagined. I'm Andrea.M. and welcome to the Oz Files, The Truth Is Out Back. And before we get into today's Oz Files, if you enjoy missing persons stories, real crime, disasters, the unexplained, the lost and unsolved, and a little of the paranormal thrown in for good measure, with a distinctly Australian flavour, then you've found just the channel for you, as that's mainly all that we do here. So if this sounds appealing to you, please do me the favour of smacking that like button, repeatedly push subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss a video, and share with your friends. Also, feel free to drop a comment or a suggestion for a future video in the comment section below. It's subscribers like you who make all the difference to creators like myself in furthering our careers here on YouTube. Without your constant support, I wouldn't be able to keep creating content like this. With all that said, let's begin. And today's Oz File has been requested by our own lovely Rebecca St. John, and it is the Peel Island Leper Colony. And this was something I myself had absolutely no idea existed, and thank you so much to Rebecca for the suggestion. And it was that leper colony that Phyllis Ebbage, after a misdiagnosis, would find herself being sent to without even being able to say goodbye to her 2 young daughters. And she never actually received a clear diagnosis of leprosy. Phyllis was forced to spend 12 years on Peel Island, a leper colony off the southeast Queensland coast. Peel Island is a small heritage-listed island located in Moreton Bay, east of Brisbane, in southeast Queensland. The island is a locality within the local government area of Redland City and is a national park. In 2016, the census described Peel Island as a population of 0. The island is only accessible by watercraft, and it is likely to see dugongs, turtles and dolphins frequent the waters around Peel Island. And for all its beauty, its dark past as a quarantine station and asylum cannot be ignored. During the mid-19th century, Peel Island was used as a quarantine station for the colony of Brisbane. Sailing ships would anchor to the north of the island, and the passengers would disembark on Peel Island for a quarantine period before moving on to Dunwich on nearby North Stradbroke Island. The arriving sailing ships would be fumigated and scrubbed down with carbolic to sanitise them before they ventured on to Brisbane, and that's where the new arrivals would disembark. Remains of the old quarantine station are at the southwest corner of the island, and this is also where an old well can be found. Peel Island was used as an asylum for vagrants from Brisbane around the start of the 20th century, but the conditions were too harsh and the inmates were moved on to Dunwich on nearby Stradbroke Island. Peel Island was also used as a sisal farm. The inmates would harvest the sisal and manufacture rope, which was sold to help fund the asylum. Remnants of the sisal plantations are still visible when walking around the western side of the island. Between 1907 and 1959, the island was a leper colony. And it was to this leper colony that Phyllis Ebbage would find herself wrongly exiled to. Leprosy, the feared and then untreatable disease, arrived in Australia in the 1800s, causing panic amongst the population and prompting the government to pass the Leprosy Act of 1892. Those who contracted the disease were sent to designated quarantine sites or lazarettes for treatment. With no known cure, the internment was often a life sentence. In 1940, when her girls Vere and Desley were aged 2 and 3, Phyllis had been ill for a few months. She was feeling languid and tired, and she noticed brown marks appearing on her body. On the advice of her father-in-law Albert, she visited the Townsville doctor who ran tests and diagnosed leprosy Hansen's disease. However, the doctor never told Phyllis of the condition that he had diagnosed her with, although the diagnosis was never made particularly clear to anybody, including her. Instead, he told Albert, Phyllis's husband Les, and other family members that she would be forcibly quarantined. Phyllis herself would later recall, the family gathered at the house speaking in hushed undertones, but nobody was talking directly to Phyllis herself. Little did Phyllis know her family were making arrangements for her to fly out of Townsville to Peel Island, to the Lazarette and the Leper colony. Phyllis had no idea what was going on until her father-in-law broke the bad news to her the night before she was to leave. However, Phyllis was still very much being kept in the dark about her situation and believed that she would be returning home in a day or two, so she didn't sort of bother to say goodbye to her two young daughters as she didn't want to frighten them, and she thought she'd be back in a couple of days. And this would play on Phyllis's mind for the next weeks, days, months and years that would follow. Phyllis was then flown to Brisbane and taken on the 11-kilometre boat journey to Peel Island, which sits off the coast of Cleveland. The journey took more than 4 hours, and Phyllis recounts, I could see buildings, but I didn't know what they were for. Upon arrival, they showed her to her hut and where to go, and Phyllis would go on to also say that the hut was so primitive and there was just absolutely nothing there. It was a terrible place, and there were only fortnightly visits allowed from the patients' families. Many of the men and women transported to Peel Island never saw their families again because the leprosy sufferers were disowned out of shame. Some patients died on the island. Phyllis would also go on to say, I didn't have the right treatment then. I tried a lot of treatments there and they nearly killed me. And she will talk about how many doses of penicillin that she had been given trying to fight what they thought was the leprosy. And she said that she had 3 lots of it and it almost killed her. And one night she was going down to get another lot of penicillin and she nearly collapsed on the way. So she wouldn't take it anymore. She had the feeling that they had given her way too much. So Peel Island enforced isolation from the main population, and the legislation allowed authorities to remove anyone who was suspected or diagnosed with leprosy, and this included taking children from school without their parents' knowledge nor their permission. They would just take these children out of the schools and ferry them across to Peel Island. And for, with Phyllis, with what she's going through, she's absolutely terrified. She has no idea what's going on. She's not exactly sure that she even has this disease. And she's a grown woman. Can you imagine what that would have been like for children to just be yanked out of school? Right, you're going to this island. You're never going to see your family again. I can't even imagine the level of terror for an adult, let alone a little child, being yanked out of school and ferried to Peel Island. Conditions on the island were very grim. In the early days of its operation, Peel Island was more like a prison than a medical isolation facility for the sick. Patients were put into bark huts with dirt floors and treated almost like convicts. Some patients were locked up or chained by police before they were taken to the site. Each compound was surrounded by fences almost 2.5 metres high to prevent ethnic groups mixing, particularly at night. So racial segregation was also rife on Peel Island at this time. Phyllis wouldn't see her children again until 1948, 8 years after she was transported to the island in Moreton Bay. Visits were restricted to once a fortnight for just 30 minutes. The only way to access the island was by taking the government's steamboat. A round trip took 8 or 9 hours and no children were allowed. However, Phyllis's husband would find a way to get around the visiting restrictions. He was getting fed up with the restrictions, so he went and bought himself a boat, and he would visit Phyllis secretly, and he would bring the daughters to see Phyllis on the island. Phyllis, truly feeling how hopeless her situation was, even offered to divorce her husband, to which he would say no. and his devotion never wavered. In the whole 12 years that Phyllis was on the island, he stayed with her and he stayed firm. The Ebbridges would go on to have several secret rendezvous on Les's boat before the island authorities spotted them and reported them to the police. There was a water police chase, in which ended up with Les being charged and fined a whole £10. His escapades were then reported by Brisbane papers at the time, and this would actually turn out to be one of the best things that could have ever happened, because this would shine a light on what people didn't know about and the atrocious conditions on this island, and this would start to bring about much needed change. Not long after, the government launched a program to rebuild some of the huts and improve conditions for the patients. Phyllis would be reunited with her family for good in 1951, then a decade after Phyllis was first dispatched to Peel Island from her North Queensland home on the wrong diagnosis. Phyllis's release was bittersweet. The revelation she may have been returning negative results all along while still incarcerated on the island was almost too much for her to bear. It was something I don't think Phyllis ever got over. It was such a big thing in her life. Miss Thurgood says she is a curator for the Peel Island Trust, and she would tell that years later. You can tell from the way that she talks about it in the oral history when she was speaking in her 80s. She kept asking the staff on the island why they wouldn't let her go. She remembered that one of the people in charge told her she needed to get her husband to stop because he was campaigning. He was writing letters to newspapers and politicians, and he would keep it up for years. Phyllis was released shortly after her husband stopped complaining, according to the curators. 9 years after Phyllis Ebbridge would finally be released from Peel Island, it would be closed down as a quarantine station for good in 1959. The squalid huts patients were forced to live in are still there on the island and have been restored by the Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service. Access to the old quarantine site is tightly controlled. Overnight visits are available only to members of the Friends of Peel Island, who arrange monthly working bees subject to weather conditions. Even then, they must travel by ferry to 1 mile on Stradbroke Island and then on to Peel Island, and that's via a small vessel that seats about 6 of the volunteers. However, Peel Island is open to the public as far as Horseshoe Bay and Platypus Bay and has popular boating spots and some campsites, but permits are required for camping. Although I'm not sure if it's a destination that I would like to visit after the terrible mistreatment of the people who were held there for so many years, and the fact that many of them did die whilst on the island and are still buried there. So Peel Island operated as a lazaret from 1907 to 1959. The Peel Island Lazaret or Leprosarium is important to Queensland history because of its social and political significance in terms of state health policy, serving as a reminder of the conditions in which people lived and worked on the island. Particularly under earlier operations of the lazaret, the isolation of Peel Island more resembled incarceration than that of a medical institute for ill patients. In many instances, sufferers were removed from their families and communities without notice or an opportunity to say goodbye. And I can't even imagine what that would be like, because a lot of it would have just been on, oh, that guy over there has leprosy, we need to lock him up, when he may not have had it at all, like Phyllis's case. Patients were often locked up or chained by police before they were taken to the lazaret. There have been several accounts of patients being trawled behind a charter ship, isolated on a dinghy en route to the island. Once at the facility, patients sought help from the outside community and the press in order to improve the dreadful conditions to which they were subjected. Because the lazaret was designed around the principle of isolation, each person was housed in a separate hut, then grouped into 3 compounds according to gender, race, and the severity of the illness. So they weren't even really allowed to mix with each other, and at that point, what would it have hurt? They're on the island, they all had the same condition, they're not going to reinfect each other. So you had no chance to make a friend. You had no chance to sort of mix with anybody outside your own gender or ethnic group. And you've had nobody else to see. And I would imagine these groups would be quite small. You might make a friend or two, but you would have some people that actually did have leprosy, and those people would die. So it would be hard to get close to people, I would imagine, in that kind of a situation. But for me, I think it was just another portion of how cruel the authorities were back then. So I can't even imagine what these people went through, and I still can't believe that I had no idea that Peel Island and the leper colony even existed. Each compound was surrounded by an 8-foot, 2.4 metre tall wide fence, which would also be locked at night, as to prevent perceived illicit behaviour between the patients. And if people are that sick, there's not going to be any illicit behaviour anyway. In a standard hut, each patient was supplied with a bed, a chest of drawers, a table and a chair. In the lazarette's later years of operation, awnings were also added to the huts to protect the patients from the elements. Other lazarette buildings on the island included a kitchen, dining room, bathhouses, nurses' cottages, attendants' quarters and caretakers' residences. For many years, it was prohibited to remove the bodies of the patients who had died on the island, making it necessary for them to be buried there, as I mentioned earlier. To this day, the site has been preserved and remains a confronting reminder of the conditions at the lazarette. And this is where we leave the rather unsettling and dark chapter of Australian history and the Peel Island leper colony. And when you think about it, 1959 was not that long ago, and also that many patients like Phyllis were wrongly diagnosed, and it just absolutely gives me the chills. So I'd love to hear your opinions on today's Ozfile. Have you ever heard of the Peel Island Lazarette? I'd love to know your thoughts, so please leave your comments below and start a conversation about this dark and very well kept secret in Australian history. And as for today's video, that's going to do it. Thank you all so much again for watching, and stay tuned for our very first paranormal investigation for 2023. We are on location this weekend, but the location will not be revealed until the video airs. So if this is of interest to you, stay tuned. Also, stay safe, be happy everybody. Much love to you all, and thank you all so much for the people who have checked on me during my current illness. I mentioned on my last video I'm actually suffering a GERD flare-up at the moment, but I'm starting to get a handle on it through all natural measures and a little bit of a change in diet, which I don't really mind because it's all really healthy, beautiful, fresh food. So I'm really actually quite excited about going on this journey back to being healthy again. And for everybody who checked on me and sent me well wishes, thank you all so much. I appreciate you all. Much love to everybody, and I will be seeing you all again very soon. Bye.